Welcome to Reconsider. I'm Bill Hartman. This is the podcast to challenge you to ask better questions, to look beyond traditional models of thinking and arrive at better health and fitness solutions.
Does it sound egomaniacal?
No, and I'm trying to play the devil's advocate listener who's going to be like, Bill thinks he's the best and all this other stuff, because it's not what you're saying. But you have to, in order to have a contrarian viewpoint, you have to sound like that. Unfortunately.
Well, like I said, I usually sound half crazy.
Yeah, but that's what a contrarian is going to sound like. And
right.
It's when you look at all of these different things that are useful. So say in physical therapy, you see all of these models that are useful, and they've been helpful with your treatment of people. And you see that there's a lot of things about each of these models that are principle-based that seem to be coherent across all of the models. But there are a lot of things that are not. So It would be reasonable to think that all of the things that are not relatable between the models might not matter as much as the things that do, span the models. So that's sort of what we've been talking about. What we talked about in the first episode a bit is just seeing what's available, understanding that although it is useful and you could just stop and you could probably just continue being a physical therapist for the next 30 years, doing exactly what you did when you started being a physical therapist, and you'd be fine, right? Like people want the average people who collect an average paycheck and have an average family life and an average size house, like all that stuff. You could just be that forever, and maybe that's how you want to live your life. But when it comes to seeking progress and trying to be the most useful problem solver, or I'm going to go ahead and say maybe the best way to, I think the funny way to explain my job is I'll just put world's greatest detective, just because that's
well, I have a painting. I have a painting that I got as a gift from my boy Zach that has got Sapolsky, or not Sapolsky, but Sapolsky on there. I got Einstein. I got what's his butt, the Pollock. I got Pollock up there. I got my Bruce Willis, and I got the Batman. Right?
Yeah,
it's all of those guys.
For anyone not in the know, Batman would be the world's greatest detective, and that's what we're referring to.
Greatest detective, for sure.
I mean, my hat.
Oh, can you show the hat? There you go. Very nice.
The subtle bat.
There you go.
But yeah, so in the first part of this, we kind of talked about, we jumped around a little bit. So hopefully anyone listening to this is going to have to be pretty interested in your model anyways, but that's okay.
Right.
Just because talking about this is useful, I think. We talked about the constraints that needed to be addressed, like how they are different, and there are archetypes and configurations. We could get more into that, or we can just keep doing a more surface level representation of it, because we also touched on,
you put things together. So first principles. So these are the absolutes that without context, they're the absolutes, and then you start to look at the constraints, and then you start to look at as far as context goes, that's the environment, the affordances in the environment, and how they influence what the options actually are, and then you practice. Right. So this is another part that comes into play, is you do things and you observe. And so you're always running the experiment. So back on December 29th, 2016, when I whiteboarded this thing for the first time, there was an N = 1 on the board. Right. And then there was the within subjects design experiment. And that's a big part of this, because it took a lot of doing and failing and doing and failing, and then try to explain this, and then looking for resources that would help explain this, but yet remain coherent. And so there was a lot of process involved with this. And so when you think about anybody that's seen my drawing that I do, like for the intensive, where I have a 10,000 foot view of my perspective, it's broken into three segments, which are the principles, the processes, and then the plans. And so a lot of the stuff that we talk about falls under the principle and process element of that, because that's how it evolved. By trying to answer the questions that I would see represented. It's like trying to explain why something would happen in a certain way, and then seeing the consistencies in that. And then that starts to allow you to recognize the underlying principle of why you would see some measure of consistency.
Right. Yeah. And I'll post, if it's all right with you, I'll post a picture of the model just on the podcast here so people can see something you haven't posted before. Like I know you did a video on your model.
I don't know if I posted it in public or not. Like I said,
it exists as at least a thumbnail on your YouTube page. I know that for a fact.
Okay. Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah. So we'll include that. Just
like that's really like I said, it's a 10,000 foot view.
Yeah. And that's as a little short aside to that, I think if anyone listening to this is still listening and interested in this, it's useful to know what your model is as well. So kind of write it out in the way that we just presented with that picture and what Bill was saying.
Yeah.
But yeah, like for a long time, the model was sort of known in a very small circle. It was called the 3 Ps, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, like the PPP model.
Principles, process, and plans.
And there's really no reason for anyone to know anything different. But I think one of the things I want to try to have us do with this series of podcasts or whatever recordings we're doing talking about your model is I want it to become a resource for people that ask you questions about your model, but they don't know it. So they say, Bill, can you explain the expansion compression model? Or you go on a podcast, for instance, and the people
see, you just said that. Now people are going to think that that's what they're going to call it.
Right. Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. We're trying to give someone a resource to go to. So if say you do go on a podcast and the person that's interviewing you or talking to you says the expansion compression model, you'll have somewhere to direct them after you tell them that that's not what it is. So that's what why this will be the most useful thing, because it's like It gives people an opportunity to actually figure it out, because they can try to. Part of the problem is that there's obviously no, we're not assuming malice or anyone trying to do anything shady by just repeating this model or talking about the model. They just have tried to piece together all this information and have heard things about what it's about. So they just say these things. Like that's why we're going to call it the expansion compression model. Yeah. But yeah, that's, you just talked to Robbie. We talked about it, and even Robbie that was his way of explaining it. And that's, no fault of his. It's just what everyone else seems to say and what seems to be the things that you're talking about, but it's not really what it is. So it's like we're trying to give a resource for people to actually understand what it is. So we've talked about being constraints led in the approach, which is not something that you came up with. Like the whole constraints led approach of thinking is, if you
dip into dynamical systems theory right away,
right, that's what it is.
Right off the bat, you're going to get hit with like, okay, this, and they'll break it down. They'll break it down into 2 segments. They'll say, well, these are the structural constraints, and then these are unfortunately, they'll say they're the functional constraints.
Oh, you said it.
I like I said, I threw up in my mouth first. I threw up the F word. The F word is on the dirty words list, right?
Man,
but that's the standard terminology. So I will give credit where credit is due. But right away they're going to say like this is. And again, this is one of those things that like jumps out at you. Like when you read this, you go, oh, that stuff matters a lot. And they're not all exactly the same, right? There are variations on a theme here. And then those variations are influential in the outcome. And that's what we're trying to understand. It's like, okay, within this body of evidence, within this context is like, how are we behaving?
Right. And again, for those listening who are a little more on the devil's advocate and upset side about things, we're not saying that Bill invented the constraints-led approach or dynamical systems theory. But what we are mentioning that's important is that when it comes to the constraints that are listed, if you don't understand the constraints of the system that you're talking about, then that's the problem. It's not the fact that like we're using dynamical systems theory, which is principles based, but it's not understanding the constraints is the issue. It's that thinking going back to what we said in the first episode, thinking that the structural and constraints for a human being are the same across the board is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of one of the main tenets or principles of this unified model.
Even so, just to reiterate a point, it's like everything that's come before is useful to some degree, but at some point there is an interference that caps the value, and we're trying to eliminate that as much as we can. Right?
That's an excellent point. Yeah,
it's
because
difficult.
you're gonna, and you come over the course of your career and whatever it is, you're gonna come to a point where the things that you do and the model that you use aren't working when you expect them to. And when you hit a point like that, there has to be some sort of evolution to your model, because your model should have the answer to that.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, that's when you need to seek further help and understanding. But a lot of people don't. They just chalk it up to an exception to a rule, and then they create a new rule in order to just keep them within their very straightforward worldview that seemed to work.
Yeah. The ultimate evolution of this is just trying to answer questions.
Yeah.
Right? Coming up against something, asking a question, then trying to answer it, and not having to reestablish a new rule every time you try to answer a question. You could do that. If you paid attention and you made a list long enough, you could probably pull it off and still be effective, right? Because again, we're mostly playing with probabilities anyway, right?
That was going to be my next point.
Well, I will let you make your point.
I was going to talk about Annie Duke's book.
Oh, Annie Duke, of course.
Yeah.
So you talk about models, you got to mention George Box. You talk about probability, you talk about Annie Duke. Those are like, Annie Duke's one of my favorite resources in that regard.
Yeah.
Right?
So
she explains it exceptionally well. Thinking in bets.
Let's just do. So there's going to be a lot of that's going to be referenced in the show notes. There'll be a link for that book. We'll also link Robbie's podcast and Pat's podcast, because those are good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about probabilities and how that influences dynamic systems.
Yeah, because here's the thing that I don't want to misrepresent. It's like there's very little knowing, like in my opinion. So I've had a buddy in the treatment room. He just likes to learn and observe, and I would do something with a level of confidence, and he said, "You knew that was going to happen," and I would say, "Well, not exactly. I just thought it was more likely that it would happen." Because you're playing probabilities. So if I am 82% correct most of the time, I do really, really well. But you got to understand that there's that 18% that always exists that you're going to fail miserably. And so my failures are daily. Like, you fail daily. Like, you do something, it's like, didn't get the outcome that I wanted. But having a strong representative model allows you to determine, it's like, okay, what are the other possibilities that could be going on here? Now I make another selection. I determine my trade-off, and now I do get the outcome that is much more favorable, at least in the direction that I've been trying to go. So, as we would say, or Annie Duke would say, we're playing poker, not chess. Where chess would be very, very, very clear on what the possibilities are. They're like, the constraints are very, very strong under that circumstance. When we're playing around with human beings, like, the constraints are exceptionally important, but there's a lot of influences that we don't control or don't even know. Like the unknown unknowns exist, and we would probably fall back on luck in that circumstance.
Yeah, and the whole idea of a unified model that's the most useful is going to be something that's competing against luck. Which is actually another great book that's by a guy named Clayton Christensen. So I'll put that.
Oh yeah.
That's great. A lot of that, it talks about innovation and how you can't just like assume things are based on averages and try to get lucky with what you're doing. There's other questions. A lot of it just has to do with asking questions. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about that you had mentioned was the idea of failure and how that needs to be part of anyone's model. But what you like to talk about when you talk about your model is safe to fail experiments.
Correct.
So it's planning to fail, but managing the risk of that failure in a way so that when you fail, you can almost fail upwards, I guess would be a way to put it.
Well, some of it's reframing, and some of it is like an absolute. So this comes straight out of working in complexity. So if you throw Cynefin on the book list, that'll be another good representation for people to look at. So it's how you make sense of things. So we deal with complex humans. So literally we're complex adaptive systems. And so in a complex adaptive system, there may be a cause and effect, but it cannot be determined except for in hindsight, which means you have to do something, see what happened, and then you can determine to a better degree as to why that may have happened. Like that's the goal. That's why this is hard, right? That's why, again, it's probability management versus being like, oh, it's either yes or no. So
it's also the relationship of induction and deduction, right?
Well, okay. So let's scrap that. We're actually in a situation of abduction. So in when you're using abductive reasoning, you have incomplete information. So I mentioned unknown unknowns. So if you're dealing with unknown unknowns, I got news for you. You don't even have all the information that would be necessary to make the best absolute decision under the circumstance. So because we're using incomplete information, this would be abductive reasoning, which again leaves a lot on the table. And again, this is why it's going to come down to a probabilistic situation versus like an absolute yes or an absolute no. There are situations which have much greater clarity, which would fall into a representation. If we use again a Cynefin framework, that they would call clear, something that would be really obvious, and that would be okay. You're playing basketball, you jump up in the air for a rebound, you come down, you land on somebody's foot, you sprain your ankle. That's obvious. That's very clear as to what the cause and effect was of that ankle situation. But if somebody just walks in, with insidious onset of ankle pain, that's a whole different situation where we have so many unknowns as to what are the why. And so we would approach those things a little bit differently, where we do have to experiment. So we run an experiment that does not put somebody at high risk of, like, if it does fail, something bad happens, right? So if you're iffy on execution of something that would increase the risk, put somebody in danger, those are the things that we want to avoid. So we're running experiments, but if it does fail, it provides us information as to what the next step in the process would be, but we're not putting them at risk in this process. That's a huge, huge deal.
And I think honestly, one of the aspects of the model, your model, that is going to be the most useful for people might be that. Because I think a lot of people try to avoid failure at all costs. So then they end up not actually approaching the threshold to progress someone.
Right.
If they stay so clear of the point of failure because they're frightened of it, or they are concerned that they're going to have a setback or some sort of negative trade-off, then that's actually going to hinder progress maybe more than anything.
Well, and part of that is probably understanding what the options actually are, and I'll be the first one to admit that I don't know what all of them are, but that's part of, again, this is why this is always a work in progress. You'll hear me say, "Oh, the model just evolved," right? It's like, oh, we have another influence, we have another option that we can actually identify with some measure of consistency and coherence. It's like, okay, then we have to pay attention to this the next time. And so we're always building, like, okay, what is possible? What are the options? And the more of those we know, then we can run more experiments in a much more safe to fail way.
Yeah. And then it stops becoming like, oh, well, that's an exception. And then, oh, that's an exception. It's that thought of this is exceptional should be the point in time where you ask, well, why? And why is what I was currently doing not working? And what are so this is that concept that we had talked about very early on in the podcast about counterfactual information, having to use your imagination and what you know to determine why something might have happened outside of what the expected outcome was, or what you might what you would expect other people would expect as an outcome. So it's like what someone did something that maybe you or I might think like, oh, that's not what they should have done, or and they got a good result, right? So the question can either stop there, or you can continue to ask, well, why might that thing actually have worked? Like, what are the other factors that are in play here?
Yeah.
And that's where that like whole idea of understanding trade-offs and being the world's greatest detective sort of comes into play.
Yeah. And then always have the understanding that you still might not be able to figure it out.
Yeah, because your model's wrong.
Absolutely.
George Box, bring him up.
Okay, so here's the opener, right? Like, I am wrong.
Yeah. But this model you're about to learn about is wrong.
This model, yeah. And then you want him to turn off the podcast there, boss.
Right.
there's your opener. Like, don't listen any
what
further.
You're about to hear
wrong.
is completely useless. No, but that certainly, I don't know how much we're going to try to grab people's attention. And it's like, how do you grab someone's attention that doesn't know anything about you and try to get them to watch an hour and a half of you talking about a model? I'm not too worried about that.
I don't know. I'm just having a good time.
So yeah, I mean, this has been great so far. I just want to like, as just a way for my mind thinking about this, and then maybe as a sort of a break for the people listening to kind of recap where we've gone so far. So we've talked about being constraints-led in dynamical systems. We've talked about probabilities as they relate to those systems. We've touched upon a bit about like what the constraints actually are structurally for the human system. And we said that there are typically, I think maybe we should go through, when it comes to explaining the model, it's like from the joke perspective, or like we kind of kid around about like, they're the rules of the model, so that there's like you have two strategies in which you can move. There's two extremes of structural archetypes. There's 4 to 16 potential configurations. There are no planes of motion. There is no spoon. Which works on just so many. I mean, we've never talked. You and I have this joke between us, but we've never really talked about it. It works on so many levels, because there's the being spoon fed aspect of it.
Right.
There's the reality. There's the reality bending aspect of the kid in the Matrix saying that there is no spoon. Right. That's true too, because it's just like we're perceiving this, potentially limitless reality of dimensions with just a very like blunt instrument. It's like we can only perceive so much information.
I'm afraid so.
And we got 3 dimensions that we can perceive of the potentially, who knows, thousands.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I don't know where to go now. I just kind of like ran myself off a cliff. I don't know. Like, this is one of those conversations where I don't really know what I've been talking about, and you don't know what you're talking about. So we're these two like cyclones circling each other.
It's like two guys. It's like two guys sitting in a nursing home having conversations with each other, but only by themselves.
Yeah, that's the joke, right? It's like, are we just in the corner of a padded room, just having this conversation with no one?
I have that thought on a daily basis. Like my reality is I'm probably sitting in a nursing home alone in a wheelchair somewhere, and this is all taking place in my head.
You're just rocking back and forth in the corner.
Yep.
Grand unified principles, grand unified theories, Newtonian.
Yeah.
Lagrangian, Newtonian, Einstein.
Oh, whew. Yeah, you're getting above my pay grade. That makes me uncomfortable when I start talking about that stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, just keeping it basic is going to be where we should continue to be. I think maybe just expanding on what I just rattled off in terms of like, what are the it's like if you were to make a t-shirt with bullet points about the model, those are the things, it's the things you typically talk about, like 2 strategies, 7 components of force,
gravity, water,
structural archetypes,
pressure,
configuration, pressures and volume relationships,
pressure, propulsion,
Yeah, that would be good, because that's been a perspective that's changed over time. So if someone was to look at a video of you talking about the model from 4 years ago, it would be different.
Yeah,
They would.
yeah. Well, it's just an evolution.
Well, sure. And my first experience with let's talk about that. My first experience with it was talking about the spectrum of load to propulsion, and that evolved into just talking about propulsion. So maybe we talk about that.
Well, okay. So, and this would be represented by the fact that anytime something pushes against you, there's a pushback. And that's a very Isaac Newton, law, if you will. And so it's just a recognition of that. So I always get the question, it's like, why don't you just talk about gait? And the reason that I don't just call it gait is because that's not the only representation of propulsion.
Also, stance is very confusing.
I'm not a big fan of stance because I'm not standing. Stance implies a static representation. And when we're propelling, we're actually moving through space in contact with a medium. Okay. So if we want to give it a definition.
Right.
And so a swimmer swims against the resistance, uses resistance against water. That's propulsion. And it follows the exact same rules. Therefore,
regardless of gait.
if I talk about correct, so in a gait's walking. I just prefer walking. Just walking is a good representation because it allows us to see many things, and it's a good foundational representation because once we identify the shapes that are involved in it, those are the things that keep showing up. So whether you're rolling across the ground, whether you're swimming in water, whether you're walking on land, whether you're sprinting, right? If you're moving, white cells that move out of circulation into the cellular environment use the exact same principles. It's kind of cool to see, actually, once you understand it. But that's why I use that terminology. I'm not doing it to be contrarian. It is a contrarian concept, but I will hazard to guess that you will see it show up in a couple of books. The one that comes to mind would be like Michaud's Human Locomotion. Like he'll talk about propulsion, but they will only talk about it in a certain aspect of walking. Where I would say it has to be applied across the board, because if I'm in contact, let's just use walking. If I'm in contact with the ground, if I don't push back, I collapse. Therefore, I am always propelling myself because I'm always moving forward under those circumstances. I might move forward at a slower rate, but I'm always moving forward. So there is always an element of propulsion in play at all times. And so if we recognize that, then it's like, oh, the universal principles are actually propulsion. It's not walking. Walking is just one representation of propulsion. If I understand that, then maybe I can extrapolate that to other forms of movement through space.
Yeah.
In fact,
and I think
all of them would have that description.
Right. Because we're trying to come up with something that's coherent, and there isn't exceptions in different realms. It's all just in reality, based in our reality. These are things that seem to be true about movement in general for everything.
Right.
And you mentioning like shape change and propulsion, that's because, like you said, there are, you could see immune cells and you could see amoeba and at the cellular level, like the tiniest organisms, things that potentially we were evolved from, they move the same way. Yeah,
that's why we.
Well, because it's
so the rule doesn't change. What changed was the constraints evolved, but the rules never changed. It's like when you were a single cell, you did things a certain way. Now that you're multicellular and you have different like evolved constraints, you still have to follow the same rules. So again, that in my mind, like that makes me feel comfortable that the path that I'm taking is correct because it is coherent. Like I don't have to make up new rules.
Yeah. So let's ride that then. I think that, so maybe talking about rules in nature, and how when nature finds something that tends to work, it just sort of sticks with it. And then that can lead us to like iteration.
Sure. I don't want to get too deep into that because it gets a little too deep.
It's an important part of understanding your model, I believe.
Right. Well, again, if you think about, I think Sapolsky talks about this actually quite well in one of his lectures when he's talking about the bifurcation process. He might be talking about either the blood vessels or the lungs, and I can't remember which it was, but they're both kind of the same representation of this tree. It's like the rule is you get a branch, that branch splits into two, the next branch splits into two, and so on and so forth, that eventually you get this, big representation of what appears to be a very complex tree, when the reality is it was just following a simple rule. It's just that the starting conditions were different every time you applied the rule, and then that's what leads to complexity. And so all we're trying to do is sort of undo that process. And again, that falls under the sort of the reverse engineering element of it.
Right. And when you're talking about iteration and you're talking about shapes and you're talking about the commonalities between them all,
right?
I think
it's the repeating elements.
Yeah, and that's and we can think about that mathematically, and we're talking about the things that tend to be the most true when it comes to science are going to be the things that are based in physics and math. It seem to be universal constants of things. So when you talk about the math and physics aspect of shape, you're going to have to think about like sacred geometry and the numbers and representations of geometry that seem to exist.
Right. Well, they're representative of efficiency. Like there's a certain reason the planets are spherical, right? Because that's the efficient shape, right? That's why it defaults into that, based on the way that gravity works, however that works, right?
Mm-hmm. So okay. So this is an interesting. I hope everyone's enjoying riding my stream of consciousness as I try to like direct Bill to talking about his model in a way that everyone can follow along with. But yeah, so on top of that, it's kind of what we're thinking.
Can I just say something? Can I just say something that this always makes me uncomfortable? It's like I don't think that I'm more intelligent than anybody else. I fail miserably a lot. I just want to make that very clear. That again, it's like for some reason, whenever we talk about this stuff,
if you really were that, it just makes me. If you really were that intelligent. Sorry, Bill. Go ahead.
No, it just makes me a little. It weirds me out a little bit, to talk about it like that. But it's like because I don't think there's anything exceptional about what I put together. I think anybody could do it.
I don't agree with that, but that's okay.
Well, I don't know. It's just weird. It's just weird.
Yeah,
for me.
Well, it's because you have a level of humility to you that is sort of important for progress as well. It's I don't. I think I just hate to sound. I don't mind sounding crazy. I just don't want to have the egomaniacal representation. Well, yeah, we mentioned that a couple times. I think we mentioned that a couple times already. It's the being able to present this information in the way that's necessary for people to listen to it, because there has to be, in order to anyone to want to listen to something and disseminate that information and have that change their worldview, it has to come from a place of confidence. And the way that people are exposed to new information and learning, the sources that they're getting their information from are overly confident in many cases. So that becomes the benchmark for trying to become an educator, is that you have to speak with such a level of confidence that is on the borderline of being egomaniacal in order for people to listen in a significant way, which is tough.
Yeah, I should probably just skew myself towards the crazy side of things and just stick with that, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully I'm not coming across as some sort of like sycophant when it comes to talking to you about this stuff.
Well, we're talking
don't
about it together, so you don't really have a choice. You don't really have a choice.
Yeah, I'm kind of looped into this thing. Well, the long and short of it is, if you were so smart, you wouldn't need me to be able to do any of this.
I'd be
You'd
wicked
be doing
smart.
all this by yourself. You'd be wicked smart.
I'd be wicked smart, like Good Will Hunting.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so now that we've completely tanked the momentum of the conversation again, I got to try to.
Well, I can't help it because it gets weird. It gets weird.
So we were talking about sacred geometry, and we talked about efficiency, and we talked about shape change, and the general. Okay, so the general rules for shape change and movement seem to be sort of universal for whatever we're talking about. And
right.
you had mentioned like sprouting tree branches, and it's like, hey, why does a sprouting tree look like the cardiovascular system of a human? It's like, why does it branch in the same way? And it's just like, well, that seems to be the most efficient way to branch.
Exactly, because it works. It works.
Yeah.
And so it stands to reason that we should see that consistently represented. And it's kind of the same thing. Why can we study other animals? Right? Like why do we study other animals? Well, because there's elements that we'll see in other animals that apply directly to us from an evolutionary standpoint. It's like, if we can understand them, then we understand ourselves better. So I'm always looking at the comparative anatomy. Like
and you had mentioned earlier, it's like understanding something, it will require you knowing where it came from. Where did this thing come from?
Yeah. It's like so you just look at some of your anatomy, and and then you look at an amphibious animal, and then you start to see the commonalities, and then you see the subtle differences, and then that actually helps you understand why we are different than them. Like, why aren't we the same? Why was there some sort of evolutionary difference that allowed us to move in another direction that constrains them? Right? Because they have constraints just like we do. They move a certain way, but they have to follow the exact same principles. And so then the way that they execute gives us more information.
Right.
And that's hard. That's hard because when you work in a gym atmosphere or you work in rehab and you want to talk about lizards, it's like, okay, how is that helpful? But it actually is. When you look at things from the anatomical perspective, it allows you to arrive at solutions, because think about this: there's certain muscles they're essentially the same, but because they're constrained differently, they behave differently in other animals. And like I said, that provides reasoning behind how we might have to do something.
Right. Well, it just gives us it gives us a larger net to cast, because we keep increasing the types of analogies that we can use in order to sort of frame our model of thinking, which I think is part of the goal of what we're talking about here.
So, yeah. And so the more filters that you have for a piece of information, the closer to reality I think that your representation would be. Right? If we only have one perspective to go on, then it's the proverbial, okay, I only have one tool. So, like if all I have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail kind of concept. Right.
Yeah.
And so then the goal is to continue to expand what the potential representations are, and then identifying the options, and then arriving at better decisions. Ultimately, that's the goal. The goal is not to satisfy an ego. The goal is to, like, I really want to know what the best course of action is.
Yeah.
Right?
You want to have the answer. You want to not only have an answer to a potential problem, but you want to be able to get there within the quickest route possible.
Right. Right. And it requires a great deal of curiosity and then stick-to-itiveness, because it's not fun. There's a lot of times where it's not fun, and it gets very, very difficult. And then you bang your head against the wall a bunch of times, and then you've got 8 books laying out on the table, and you're trying to make, some measure of connection.
Right.
Okay.
And that also, it's important that the reconciliation with the fact that you are wrong, and going into every day of your work knowing that you're wrong, and expecting to fail sometimes. But what we had mentioned earlier, as repeating that, as long as you've sort of set yourself up to have these sort of safe to fail experiments, you should welcome these failures.
Absolutely. Again, because it's like, of course, it would be nice to hit the home run, as we say, every time, but the failures. Here's the benefit of failures. Failures tend to make you ask questions. Like when you're successful, you make an assumption that, okay, what I did was right, without going back and questioning yourself. And this should be part of any management situation. Is you should always, regardless of the outcome, try to ask yourself the same questions, like, okay, what actually happened? Why do I think it happened? Was there an alternative? If I did this, what were the possibilities? What are the secondary and tertiary consequences? Rather than just asking that after you fail. Because when you start to ask that after you succeed, that really starts to expand your view of what is possible.
Yeah. So going into it knowing, it's funny because anytime someone presents you with a question about something or a case, you always say the same things. You almost always will say, well, what's the goal? Or what's the intention?
What is your intention? What is your intention?
Yeah.
You have to have an intention going in.
What is your intention? And then you need to know where did they come from? Where's their starting point?
Right.
And then you have key performance indicators based on your experience and what you know and the probabilities that you've learned to understand.
Right.
And then you run the experiment that we're talking about and make it as safe to fail as possible. That's it. That's the model. We're done, everybody. See you later.
Well, but that's a really good representation. But here's the thing: it's like your personal growth is expands each one of those. So when you talk about like a key performance indicator, so KPI, these are the things that you're going to use to determine whether you're moving in the correct direction or not. Well, how many of those do you have available to you? Do you have one? Is the only key indicator that I have a counter movement jump? Okay, well, that might be where I start. And so everybody does a counter movement jump and I work from there. And then as I gain experience, I go, oh, I could use, a toe touch, and I could use a split squat, and I could use an overhead reach, or I could use a throw, because I've expanded the representations of how the principles are applied in a variety of contexts. This is why experience matters. This is why it's a big deal to get to do this in practice, because a lot of people can repeat. I think you actually said this earlier, is like a lot of people can just repeat the information, but are you speaking from experience, or are you just repeating information? Right?
Yeah, we live in a world full of 23-year-old life coaches who are trying to tell people
one of my favorite expressions.
Yeah, like they're trying to tell people who are going through their second divorce and have alimony payments and troubles with their high-level C-suite position at their job, how they should act when they have literally no experience to draw on. Right. So it's you can offer this sort of information that you read in a book or you got in a course, and you can hope that it will give you a result, but you're not going to know. Yeah, everyone's got the best laid plan until they get punched in the face, right?
Yes, there you go. A wise man once said that consumption of information does not lead to mastery.
Yeah. Just repetition of it. Just what's the tacit knowledge versus implicit? Is that?
Yeah, very much so. Explicit. So explicit
versus implicit.
Explicit knowledge is the stuff that you can read and watch on the internet, right? The tacit, and this is where you, when I'm in the purple room, and if I'm teaching or trying to explain something to someone, this is why I sound like an idiot, because you do things that are experiential. It's like you have an understanding of the reasoning why, but in many cases, because it is tacit, it is experiential, it is exceptionally difficult to verbalize. But this is what people think. So like people say, where can I learn more about this? It's like, well, you got to do a great portion of it to actually understand it. Right.
Yeah.
It's like,
it's in the coaching.
You can read a lot of things, but you're not going to understand it until you actually get into a situation where you're executing, and this is why, when we do an intensive, this is why we have a group of people that are still working together to get better, because they're drawing on their experiences and saying, okay, under this circumstance, here's the principles involved. Here's what I thought was going on. This is what I did. And this is the outcome. Help me understand this. Right. And so you have a bunch of minds working together that raises everybody's game.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of the times they're seeking to develop this sort of coach's eye. I guess that's what it's called in a lot of in like professional circles with strength and conditioning and sport coaching. It's like you can see something and explain it. You can tell someone that something is happening based on what you're seeing, but it's oftentimes hard to explain to others. But what it tends to come from is that, like someone's understanding of something is going to be based on their pattern recognition, which takes a lot of experience. And a lot of these patterns are what we're referring to with geometry and shape. Mm-hmm. So if you can understand the shape of things, like the actual constraints you're dealing with and the shapes that those things can attain, and then you layer on the experience, you sort of superimpose the experience and the reps of coaching someone or treating someone on top of that, you can develop that that ability.
Yeah, but here's the bitter pill about that, is that you actually have already made a choice as to how you're going to see things before you see them,
without you even knowing.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's not like say I'm going to restrict my viewpoint. Like nobody does that. Nobody does that, right? They think that they're open-minded and they're looking at reality. When like, you take all of your experience, all the analogies that you have, and that creates the way that you will see everything. You have already decided how you will see it. And then all you're going to do is you're going to take the information that you observe, that you can recognize, and then you will fit it into that representation, which is why I know that I am the greatest interference to my progress, because I have a cognitive bias that will kill if the time is right. Right. I know that I constantly avoid trying to fit things into the representation. Like I want to keep asking the question it's like, how does this change things? Does it fit? Or am I just intentionally seeing things and making them coherent in my mind, or are they truly coherent? That's the big challenge at this point, which is very difficult. But we're always doing that. It's like at the low levels, like when I was a young skull full of mush 32 years ago, and I knew nothing, and I thought I knew something. It's like I was just like I took what I knew, and it's like, oh, this is that. Like this is that. It's always going to be the same thing. It's always going to fit into the same thing, right? And then you fail enough times, you go, yeah, I don't think I have it. Then you learn the next thing, you go, oh, this is it. And then everything fits into that, and everything fits into that, and everything fits into that. And this is why you'll have people that identify themselves in a certain way. Oh, I'm a manual therapist. I do manual therapy too, but I don't consider myself a manual therapist. Like that's not my only tool. And that's not my first tool in the toolbox. Right.
Yeah.
But again, it's like, if you see things only through a singular lens, you're immediately going to pose a limitation. This is why I warn people against following specific commercial systems, is because the minute you start to do that, it's like you're going to pigeonhole yourself. You're capping your potential, right? Following I want to help people see things in a better way, but I also know that I'm limited in that capacity. Like I know there's limitations in what I think and what I do, which is why I'm going to try to keep working on, always evolving what I do. because I don't want that. I don't want that limitation. I don't want it to. I don't want to be limited, but I do know that I am.
I think it's useful,
that's a hard thing to see.
And it gives people peace of mind to know that. Well, I think everyone should know that when it comes to progress in terms of profession and trying to be useful, there's going to be this tendency to sort of bounce between the two extremes of what's known as like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which you're talking about of like, you know everything and everything keeps working. So like you're the best. Yeah. And then a lot of people tend to bounce the other direction where there's so much like insecurity and they have this sort of imposter syndrome, and you sort of live within those boundaries if you're trying to push the envelope of what you're trying to do. But that's normal. And I think people should know that if you're experiencing those things, it's a normal thing. If you aren't experiencing those things, maybe it's time to sort of shake it up a little bit and maybe seek out.
If you're not uncertain and uncomfortable, you're probably not getting better. You're probably not getting better.
Yeah. You're just treading water.
Right. And there's going to be certain elements. There's going to be certain elements that you'll speak with great confidence. And that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. With the understanding that I need to understand that I do have a bias. I need to understand that as I'm presented with more information, with better evidence, that things do need to, your understanding needs to evolve.
Reconsider is sponsored by Substance Nutrition. Go to substancenutrition.com. Get your Neuro Coffee, better brain, and Synthesis, better protein, better body. Enter the coupon code RECON, RECON, and get free shipping on all of your orders.